You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi, and we are in the Haftarah of Vayaqhel, and we actually have multiple possibilities of readings here, even though all the different possibilities are more or less in the same vicinity. They are distinct of one another, and as I've pointed out in previous recordings this year, because we may or may not have a leap year, based on the weather. By the way, I pre-record these recordings, so based on the weather, there is a very good chance there will be a necessity of a 13th month, but we will only know this at the end of the 12th month. But regardless, what I'm doing is I'm recording based on the rabbinic cycle, and this is why I'm going to cover as many readings as possible. Now, by saying that, what's going to also happen here today is, because the different readings are relatively short, it will be worthwhile at least focusing on one and then touching on another, just to try to touch as many possible situations that exist here. Now, before I even start going into the reading, there's a really interesting question that comes up in regards to the point of technical information in the biblical text. One of the bigger issues I sometimes have to deal with, and especially in my work as a Hebrew teacher, as a Hebrew instructor, and also as a Bible teacher, as a Hebrew Bible teacher, is to deal with the question of what do you do with technical information. On a regular basis, I have to kind of jump around between being technical and trying to find spiritual meaning in what we're reading. And one of the problems that I sometimes have to deal with is when you reach a very, very technical part of the text, where you have detailed descriptions of items like we're going to be dealing with today, there's always this question of, well, what's the spiritual meaning here? And this always leads to some very awkward discussions, especially when I work with people who are come from certain ways of learning, certain worlds where technical information is always spiritualized. And it creates some really, really interesting tension, not necessarily bad tension, but very interesting tension, but also sometimes difficulty with one another when trying to communicate what things actually mean. And there is actually a Jewish saying, "En la dayan ela ma she'einav ro'ot." The judge only has what he has in front of his eyes, which means that the way I approach things will necessitate the idea of I can only speak in the realm of whatever information I actually have. And any other information that people try to link, in my opinion, will be conjecture. And though I know that this is sometimes not a very popular way of looking at things, the technicalities also allow us to avoid mistakes. Now, there's always this problem. There was how do you avoid being too technical while also doing things right? And there was a really interesting letter that was written over a year ago by someone who, I'm not sure if they call themselves Hebrew Roots or not, but there was a really interesting letter that came out, and it was shared by one of my friends, and I decided to read it. And the letter was basically a complaint by a young lady who complained about the fact that what's happening with the movement is that people are becoming more and more technical and less about the spiritual side of things. And I'm reading this text, I'm reading this letter, and I can identify with what she's saying, because I remember growing up, everything was very, very technical. You had all these technical rules, but then there was always this, my dad always used to say to us, but remember that your heart has to be in the right place as well. Meaning that If someone ever tells you there's a difference between, if I take something very technical in Judaism, washing your hands before a meal, if someone tells you that the vessel you use to wash your hands has to be orange, and if you use a blue one, it's not correct, obviously that person's talking nonsense. But that's a highly technical point, colors. But it sometimes reaches points like that. And you do reach a point where you have to find that balance between doing things correctly while also maintaining your connection with God, with Elohim. And what happens in time is things get eroded. And the thing is that Judaism has enough experience in this field. And what's very interesting is that Judaism, especially European Jewry, went through a very similar process that by the 1600s, 1700s, a lot of people felt everything was too technical. Life was very, very tough. And Jews were marginalized completely inside the Christian world. And life was very, very tough. And after, I think it was 1648, 1649, there was a big, several riots that went on in Eastern Europe. I think the name was the Himalayan Ski Riots. The name always eludes me exactly how to pronounce that name. And several years after those incidences, or it's actually really one big incident, the Hasidic Movement started. And the Hasidic Movement was partially a response to the overbearing technicality that developed inside the Jewish world. And people wanted to find a place, the people who were not highly educated wanted to find a place for themselves. And the truth be told, I think it's a legitimate thing. And this is why teachers have to always find this balance to be able to try to speak with anyone and everyone and be able to send a message out that speaks to everyone. But that's not always possible. And what it creates is that some people are connected to one teacher while other people connect to another teacher, and they feel more inclined to one way of thinking while versus another way of thinking. And in truth, there's nothing wrong with either way, because we're not the same. All people are different. And the question also is raised, is there really an absolute truth? And what happened with the Hasidic movement is it developed into several different types of groups. But one of the main points that came up was that there has to be a place for everyone. There has to be a place for each individual person inside the community. It can't be that you only celebrate the most highest scholars in the community, and they're the only ones who receive honors in the synagogues and so on, while the person who's just, the peddler, or the guy who's the blacksmith, or what have you, who's not educated, the only thing he really does is read the book of Psalms every day, reads a few Psalms and goes to the synagogue on Shabbat, and that's the sum of everything that he does. And he grows his beard and he keeps kosher and everything, but he's not a big scholar. And the Hasidic movement tried to give an answer to that. And what's basically happened and what's developed throughout the years, especially with myself, is that through my education, my higher education, I reached a point where there's an impasse, where on one hand, I try to be technical because this is what my education keeps on telling me to do. While on the other hand, I also have to find God inside all these details. And I've actually had this impasse several times lately with different students, because what's happened is that I go into a technicality of something, try to explain the meaning of something in its actual context, and then a question is raised of, but could it be something else? And that's a really interesting question. And the answer is, it depends. It really does depend. Now, people love throwing in terminology, like, for example, Pshat, Remesh, Drash, and Sod. It's one that I hear all the time. And I have to say, that's a very, very late term, and it's actually borrowed from the Kabbalistic world, the very early Kabbalistic world. And it doesn't mean that it always works. You can't pull that one out every time you want something to have special meaning, and then you start looking for that meaning, because it makes everything arbitrary. If everything can be interpreted in different ways, but there are no actual rules of how you do this, then it makes everything arbitrary and open to whatever interpretation you want. And that, by the way, there is a method. There's a book written by, I think, a Dr. James Burton, I think his name is, and it's about how to read different biblical texts. And one of the methods that he brings up there is a method that its name right now eludes me, but the method basically says, I read the text in whatever context I want it to be, I ignore any context, and I give the text meaning based on my necessities, which means basically I can read into a verse whatever I want. Now, there is a place to that type of reading, because sometimes there are types of texts which are very, very generalized, which means that the point of the text is to leave things much more open to interpretation, open to possibilities. Like, for example, you have different psalms that historically had there was a context there, but the context has been removed in whatever way that process went through. It's too complicated to explain it now, but that historical context is being removed, and then you can pour into it whatever personal situation or at that time situation a person might be in. Also, when you read a story, sometimes stories are kept very vague. Right now, for example, I'm reading together with one of my professors the story, we just finished reading the story of the rise of Solomon to kingship, which connects to our reading, because we are going to be reading from the Book of Kings and in the construction of the temple. And what we have is a different ways of reading that text. Is it pro-Solomon? Are there cases where there's some comments about Solomon's behavior and things like that? And we actually surveyed in a class, and people actually voiced what they read inside the text, and we heard different opinions from different people, including myself as well. I said what I thought I saw in the text as well. These are cases where I can understand why one can see more possibilities inside the text than the ones that we see on the spot. Also, because each person works with a different context, then each person sees something a little different. And we had a really interesting situation. Like, for example, my professor asked about a certain verse, and I raised my hand and said what I thought about it. And my professor immediately said, well, that's reading it through the context of such and such view. And I nodded. I said, yes, that's very, very true. It's exactly how I'm reading it, because it connects to an entire philosophy that I have regarding certain beliefs that exist in the Bible. And that's all perfectly fine, because these are sometimes things which are left deliberately vague to produce different ways of reading a text, meaning that the original writer, if I may use some technical terms here, the original writer left certain ambiguities inside the text to allow the possibility of different readings. This in turn also allows people in different generations to read the text differently depending on whatever was going on at their time. So it means that the writer had a forward thinking. He looked forward into different things. But we also have to remember that all text always has context, which means that there's some kind of background, some kind of a method, some idea standing behind the original meaning. Now, it doesn't take away from other interpretations that may help some symbolic ideas and so on, but we need to understand that we can't always know, is this what the writer actually meant? Which means that you have to be very, very careful with your opinion and with other people's opinions and to weigh, are these things possible? But there have been cases where I had to tell someone, I'm really, really sorry, this doesn't fit in. Now, why do I bring this up? Because throughout the readings that we've had, if it's about the tabernacle, about the Mishkan in the book of Exodus, or the readings in the book of Vayikra, which I've covered already in my portion readings that I've done throughout the years, we also come in contact with technicalities here in descriptions of building the temple. Now, there is the possibility, and you know what, I'm going to say, not a possibility, it is a fact that certain things that go on in our text are symbolic. There's no doubt about it, because nothing was done in temples just because they can. Things were done deliberately with a meaning. The problem is that meaning is not always clear to us. We don't always know exactly what the intent was. What we can sometimes point to is, well, we can consistently see this idea throughout different places, so there's obviously an historical context here, but what exactly is the context the writer is specifically trying to tell us here is sometimes ambiguous. And this is why interpretations of technical pieces inside the text are subject to a lot of speculation. However, sometimes this speculation is perfectly fine. That if someone can try to find some interesting link, for example, if we don't have a context from outside, maybe there's a context hiding inside the text. And that's quite possible as well. Now, our text specifically deals with the description of all the metalwork done by Hiram, specifically the bronze or copper work, depends what the material was for, because everyone talks about the Bronze Age, but it's really copper with tin, and it might be that some of these things should be interpreted as copper and not as bronze. And though bronze is mostly copper, we might be talking about two different things, and it depends. This requires research on different instruments at different periods. Weapons were obviously made of bronze, but sometimes maybe other things were made from copper, and it's a really good question. But one of the things that has to be done here is we need to understand the type of material we sometimes have in the Book of Kings. And the Book of Kings sometimes has very technical material, things which are part of a chronology, or an inscription, or a writing that's completely technical. Now, I remember the first time I heard this idea, I raised my hand and I said, well, what's the point of placing technical information in a book that is mostly with a theological message? And the answer was, and I think it's pretty straightforward, the answer has to be that the technicality, the technical information is here to record not just what a person did, but also how it relates to the history of God's relationship with mankind. That has to be the answer. Whoever put together the Book of Kings, because the Book of Kings is obviously built from multiple facets of information from different places. Someone sat down and put all this information together, because we have our description, then it says, and the rest of the information about this such and such king is in the Book of the Kings of Judah or the Book of the Kings of Israel, and so on. And there are cases where you can see how a writer is obviously basing themselves on some other text, and you can see sometimes how text moves from storytelling to more technical information and so on. And it's obvious that this is all incorporated together as one large book, but it's important to realize that this is technical information. So let's ask a very simple question. If I, for example, have a stick, and I measure the stick, and the stick is, say, whatever length it is, does that have meaning? So a person might say, look, it's just a stick. One person might say, it's just a stick, there's nothing to think here about. Moses had a stick, he used a stick, the stick was this and that length, it has no actual meaning. It's random. Another person could say, well, the standardized length of a stick back then was such and such. So this was a standardized method of making a stick. But we have to remember, Moses had a certain height, so not all sticks fit all different people. So a person can basically say, well, that's the standard length of a stick for a person that height. A third possibility is, we can find some inner meaning into the length of the stick and so on. Now, the reason I chose a stick or a rod or what have you is because there are several variables that can actually affect the length of a stick. But then you have a person who always looks for inner interpretation of things, and that person is basically avoiding the obvious. But for them, the obvious is that there's some spiritual meaning here. I would call that maybe spiritual blindness. It's like, for example, when you go out to the snow, and the snow is so white and pure that if you don't wear special protective goggles, you get blinded. You basically get snow blind, or snow blindness, and that's not healthy. It's not good. You won't be able to see for several hours. So sometimes what I feel is that over spiritualization also causes a blindness, but over technicality and over academia also causes a blindness. And you have to find that path in between the two positions to be able to really see everything. I remember during my training as an historian, we always had to compare different documents. I'll get, for example, an exercise, and I was given 3 or 4 different versions of the same story. So the first thing we had to do was read all 4 of them, and first of all mark to ourselves what's similar and what is different between the different stories. And then see how these similarities and differentiations allow us to understand the mindset of the writer. And this is the same thing here. We have a rule, and I remember my professor, she once wrote, this was during my bachelor's, she wrote to us how to read a biblical text. It was very interesting. And she says, first of all, read it twice. You never read once, read it twice. You read it twice, and you write down any questions that come into mind about the text. Then you try to see what ideas come to mind in regarding these answers, and you also look at commentaries. You read the different commentaries, and then you read the text a third time. And you see what actually fits into how you understand the text. She said this is the most basic thing you have to do every time you read anything. Now, I think that the key is in the idea of looking what you're able to see and then looking what other people are able to see as well. I'm currently, for example, dealing with a very interesting text, which I will not divulge exactly what I'm doing with this text right now. Eventually, because it's too many questions to even start opening this up. And I had a certain idea in my head. And I sat down to read a whole bunch of material about it. And by the time I was done, I had 2 Word document pages full of questions and possibilities and so on. I also read different commentaries, and the text had a completely different meaning to me when I was done with this several-week process of going through this. And then we're talking about a few verses. And now my perspective of that text is completely different than what it was originally. And some of the ideas that I've come up with now were inconceivable to me before I started. And now I'm in a different position and I'm reading these texts, and now I have to start looking for subtext. So I have context and a lot of interesting points of context. Now I have to start looking for subtext. I have to start looking for things underneath. What exactly is the writer thinking? Is it possible that there's some interesting messages here and so on? Because the context, the historical context and everything is pretty clear. Now I have to try to peel through what is the writer thinking. But if you always try to read something in one flat way, or you use a process that's always trying to kind of like jump from one position to the other, like the whole PARDES thing, the Pshat, Remesh, Drash, and Sod. Everyone's trying to jump ahead to, well, that's only in the Pshat level. So maybe the Pshat level is all you actually need here. The problem is that when you start looking for secretive meanings throw you into a very, very large world of confusion and ideas and so on that can really become dangerous. But you have to start from the pshat. You have to start from what is the simple meaning of the text and give the right amount or the proper amount of attention to that part before you jump ahead to other things. This is always my warning, because I get asked all the time in my work, symbology and inner meaning and so on, and sometimes I have to say I don't know, because this is not something that I work with. I first of all try to understand the text in its simple meaning. I'm a simple man. Give me the simple meaning first of all. And then we'll start peeling away, looking for subtext and other possibilities and so on. So why am I saying all of this? Because we have a story here. And the story here is a very simple, straightforward story. But the story itself has a very interesting meaning to me in regards to something that happened to me with this text. So I used to work in a museum, and in the museum we had a model of the temple. And this bearded man comes in, Orthodox man comes in, and he starts telling me all these midrashic stories. And he says to me, can you, he noticed that I had a Bible open and everything. And he said, are you more of a pshat person? I said, yes, that's what I do. I mostly read the text for as is and try to understand it in the simple meaning. So he said to me, do you have a story of someone, giving some kind of bravery in regards to the first temple? And I said, well, can you please define bravery? Because it's called a concept of mesirut nefesh, giving your all to something. And I said, the only story that really does stick out, except for the fact that King David seems to always, every time he did something, was always with the view of, I want to build a temple. Especially when you read the book of Chronicles, there's always the temple in the vision, in the straight vision of forward into the future of King David, and it's denied in the end. So I said, look, the only story I can think of is of a man that came from Tyre, who was taken to do work, to supervise the work of the temple. So to work on all the work on the copper and bronze instruments. I said, that's not really giving your all. And even though it's not about giving your all, it's about being selected, being chosen. And this person didn't have a very good pedigree. His mother was from the tribe of Naphtali, which means all the way up north. And his father was actually a man from Tyre. He was a Phoenician. And this man, who genealogy from his genealogy doesn't really belong to the tribe of Naphtali, is chosen to go and build massive sized instruments to the temple of God. Out of all the instruments in the temple, we only know that some of them were replaced. We have a description that Solomon did more menorahs and more tables of the showbread, and there's a whole bunch of questions about that, about how he could even do that. But what's very interesting is that he does, this man called Hiram, which is obviously a Phoenician name, and the king of Tyre was also called Hiram, Huram, there's different variations. We actually have documentation of that name being the name of people from Tzol, from Tyre. This man, who has a terrible pedigree, his father's not even an Israelite. He doesn't really have any belonging to Israel, except the fact that his mother is an Israelite. In Jewish law today, he will be considered a Jew. But in ancient times, the problem was that his mother married someone outside of Israel, and by law transfer of identity, the moment a woman married someone outside of her family, she no longer belonged to the family. That's how the law of inheritance and so on works. Which means what's more important here is what I tried to point out to this person was the fact that this man, who was not an Israelite by certain technicalities, not that he couldn't belong to Israel. His mother was an Israelite as well. But this man, whose father was not an Israelite, which means he could not make a claim to belong to the tribe of Naphtali, he could only do something through his mother, and it doesn't count, is chosen to supervise some of the greatest metalworks that have to be done in the temple, because there's no building of an ark, there's no actual building of a table showbread or the menorah or the golden altar. Those original items from the tabernacle are left, but he does everything outside. He does all the metalwork that's outside, and his metalwork is connected to the water of the temple. And water for the temple is a very, very, very central thing. Not only is it as a central theme in temples in the ancient world, which means that he's working on something which was very, very important, not just for the functionality of temples, but also for the symbology of a temple. This man makes the biggest vessels possible, which means that anyone who entered the temple, an Israelite, could not see what's inside. But an Israelite who goes into the temple, some of the things that he would see were made by a man whose father wasn't even an Israelite. The things that people could see, the things that Israelites could see, were the items made by a person who's not an Israelite. And I think that speaks volumes. I think that the idea of allowing humble people from humble backgrounds, to be in charge of such an important thing speaks volume about who God actually chooses. God chooses different people for whatever he needs, and it doesn't matter to him where that person comes from. Now here specifically there's a technicality. We talk about technical, the person has technical abilities, because his father was a metal worker. But think of the idea that his mother, because we don't know how well metal workers were in Israel at the time, his mother, who's from the tribe of Naphtali, ends up marrying a man who's a Phoenician, to have a child who ends up being associated with King Solomon's temple, with the items which are the most detailed in the building of the temple. There's actually an imbalance here on how many verses talk about the bronze and copper work versus everything else. You would think the boasting would be about the gold. This is actually from one of my professors. The boasting you would think would be about the gold, but actually the majority of the description actually has to do with the copper and the bronze. But what's more important here is the fact that this person who comes from a mother who ends up marrying outside of Israel ends up being the person who supervises and teaches everyone how to respect God through a technicality, through a technical thing of building all these different items. So yes, there's a technical issue here, but there's a really interesting message here. King David came from a humble background. King Solomon comes from a very difficult story. But because these people's hearts are in the right place, God says, I want that person. And it's quite possible that man, you have to remember, his mother was not an Israelite, which means probably amongst the Phoenicians there were questions about him, and amongst the Israelites there were questions about him. And then he ends up being chosen to build all these instruments. So there's a certain symbology here, coming from a humble background. I agree, there's a symbology here. Now, what I'm going to do here specifically, because the introduction ended up being a lot longer, because what happens is I script these, but then things come up while thinking. Don't script literally the words, because you can hear I'm not reading off of in a monotonic voice or something like that. But I do think over what I'm going to do, but things develop while I speak. So what I'm going to do here specifically is I'm going to be reading the description of the sea, what's known as Yam Shlomo, because it's really one of the more interesting pieces there. But I do want to talk about the pillars as well. So we'll read 1 Kings chapter 7, 13 to 26. Not a very, very long reading. And there are a lot of technical issues here. There are a lot of technical words here. And what happens is sometimes we're not 100% sure exactly how to translate all these different words. So what I'm actually going to do is, this is the first time I do this, I'm actually going to have to pull out a translation to be able to try to follow exactly what's going on here. Okay, so we're going to start from verse 13. It says, Vaishlach HaMelech Shlomo vayikach et Hiram mitzor. And King Solomon sent, and he took Hiram from Tyre. Ben Isha Almanahu Mate Naphtali. He's the son of a widow. He is the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali. Ve'aviv ish tzori choresh nechoshet. And his father was a man of Tyre who was a bronze worker, or metal, actually bronze or copper worker. And he was filled, and it's quite possible that there might have been a different version of this verse, but he was filled with the wisdom and the understanding and the knowledge to do all the work לעשות כל מלאכה בנחושת, to do all the work in copper and bronze, or copper, bronze, depends. Again, as I said, the word nechoshet can debate which one of the words it should be. ויבוא אל המלך שלמה ויעש את כל מלאכתו. And he came to King Solomon, and he did all of his work. Now, all of his work probably means all the work that King Solomon demanded. So we start off with the columns here. It says, so why do you have columns in front of the temple? So these were obviously, sorry, I have to be very careful with that word. The understanding is that these were not columns which were supposed to support anything. These were actually columns which were more decorative. We actually had a discussion with a architect about this, and he said that chances are that these were probably two columns or pillars which stood outside and didn't hold anything up, because they basically stood at the outside of the outer, call it a portico, I can't remember exactly how to pronounce that name, that word, or like a deck that the temple had, or maybe like a patio. I'm trying to think exactly what the word would be. But because of the type of metal, and because these were actually hollow, even though they were relatively big, they couldn't hold up a ceiling of any sort, which meant that these were mostly decorative. Now, I actually checked, and it was very common, for example, in Egypt to have columns like this in the entrances to temples. So there's some kind of context here. What this context specifically represents is a really good question. It is also possible that it was very common just to put ornaments in front of the entrances of temples, and it was a very, very common thing. But it might be that these symbolize something, because, for example, the names Yachin and Boaz, Yachin from the root kun, which is to establish, and Boaz might be from the word there is strength. Boaz, within their strength, supposed to represent the idea of God has established his kingdom, and there's might in it. There's a lot of different things that go on here, but what I remember when I was reading this, the functionality of having these columns is not very clear to us. So then it says, "Vayatzer et shnei ha'amudim nechoshen." He made, and he actually yatzar here means could be made, but also to cast. Yatzar is the act of the worker, the specific person who does his work. So, for example, a yotzer is a person who can be a potter. So here specifically, yatzar, he can also mean that he pours this. So he casted the two pillars. Shmoneh esrei amah komata amud echad. Each pillar was 18 cubits high. Vechut shtem esrei amah yesov et amud hasheni. And there's a bit of a difficulty with this verse, because it says, and a rope of 12 cubits will surround it. But then it says the Talmud Shani, the second column. It's possible that there's a bit of a textual issue here, and it might have been V'chen et ha'amud hasheni, and also thus was the second column. It's quite possible that there's a bit of a textual problem here with the way the text was passed down to us. Because if you translate, it says it is 18 cubits high, and a 12 cubit rope will surround the second column. How does that work? So it seems to be that there might be a discrepancy in the Masoretic text, and it should have been, and he surrounded it with a 12 cubit rope. Okay, that's basically the circumference, I think the word is, I'm not too sure, of the column itself, and it should have said, and thus is the second column. And two capitals were made to place on the top of the pillars, casted from bronze. 5 cubits high was one capital. And 5 cubits was the height of the second capital. The structure of this verse indicates that probably, this is verse 16, indicates that verse 15 is probably corrupted in the Masoretic text. It says, and now it says describing how they were built. Sevachim ma'aseh sevacha. So a sevacha is some kind of a network, like it's like nets, or some kind of lattice work. But basically, you can see through them. Gedelim maseh sharot, and they also had like ropes built like chains dropping from them. La koteret for each capital. Asher al rosh amudim, which of the top of the columns. Shiv'a la koteret ha'echad v'shiv'a la koteret ha'shenit. 7 probably ropes, these rope type of things, chains for one capital, and 7 to the second capital. And again, we have this structure where it says one has this, one has that, which means, again, verse 15 probably is missing a piece there, or is written incorrectly in the Masoretic text. So it says here in verse 18, Vayas et ha'amudim, and he made the columns, ushne turim saviv, and there were 2 rows all around, ala sevacha echat, on each one of the network or lattice work, lechasod et hakoteret asher al rosh harimunim, to cover the capitals that were on top of the pomegranates. V'chen asa lekoteret hashen, and thus he did and the same he did to the second capital. Now this is where it gets a little bit weird. It might be that what it's trying to tell us is that the capital itself looks like a pomegranate, and then on the pomegranate there's a lattice work, or some kind of lattice work, and then there are 2 rows, okay, which somehow cover it. The problem is that this description is very partial, and what exactly is being said here is not 100% clear. I've seen attempts to reconstruct this. Usually what I've seen is that the top, the capital itself looks like a pomegranate, there's some lattice work, and there are some kind of like 2 lines on both sides that cover, and there's these ropes that come down that probably jingled in the air or something. But the exact meaning of this verse, as far as I know, is a little bit obscure. It says, "V'chotarot asher al rosh ha'amudim ma'aseh shushan ba'ulam arba amot," and there were capitals which are on top of the pillars, the making of a shushan. Now, a shushan here is probably a flower of some sort, or some kind of lily. For example, the translation says the capitals upon the columns of the portico were of lily design 4 cubits high. Now, how exactly this fits into this entire description is also very interesting, because the word ba'ulam this is the portico, but this raises the question: was the ulam open, or was this something else that existed inside the ulam as well, inside the portico? And then it says in verse 20, "V'choteret al shnei ha'amudim gam mimal meleumat habeten asher le'ever sevacha." So again, a very complicated verse. So also the capitals upon the 2 columns extended above and next to the bulge that was beside the network. And again, this is very questionable what exactly is being described to us. It says, "V'harimonim 200 turim sariv al hakoteret hashenit," and there were 200 pomegranates in rows around the top of the second capital. Not very clear what this is. It might be that we're talking about 2 different sets of capitals. That there were larger columns outside, and then there were smaller columns inside. That the entrance got doubled, meaning that when you came to the temple, you had these 2 columns in the first entrance, and then when you entered the portico itself, there were 2 more columns inside that were of a different size and shape, because you can't fit all these different details on the same thing, because here it says that the capitals were 4 cubits, while in verse 16 it says the capitals were 5 cubits. So it's possible that we have a mixture of information here, and we have 2 different descriptions of capitals from 2 different periods. It's a possibility. Or that we might be talking about different memories of what might have been, or that we might be talking about the existence of 2 different sets of columns, which is another interesting possibility. And then it says, Vayakem et ha'amudim le'ulam ha'echal. But now it's almost as if there's only one set. And he erected the pillars to the portico of the Heichal, of the great house. Vayakem et ha'amud ha'yemani. And he erected or lifted up the right column, or the right pillar, Vayikrat shmo Yachin, and he named it Yachin. We explain what these names mean. Vayakem et ha'amud ha'semali, and he lifted up the second column, Vayikrat shmo Boaz, and he named it Boaz. Val rosh amudim ma'aseh Shoshan, the top of the pillars is the workmanship of a lily. Vatitom melechet amudim, and the work of the columns was finished. The problem that I find here is the fact that there's a bit of a discrepancy between different parts of the verses. And how exactly to answer this is a really, really good question. The problem is that there are many, many commentaries in the Book of Kings, and I think each one of them comes up with a different idea. So again, there's a problem basically understanding exactly what's being said here, and there seems to be some level of discrepancy between different parts of the verses, but we're just going to have to leave it as it is. Then we go into the description of the sea. Now, what's very interesting, by the way, is the sea and all the mechanics in regards to the waterwork. There have been discoveries from Cyprus, from the Persian era, that really strongly resemble some of the things described here. And there was actually a discovery of a water vessel that was constructed. And it's not; these things are not gigantic, but these are smaller sized models. But what's very interesting is that one of the things that was discovered was this copper vessel that is a bowl that sits on oxen, which means we actually have something close enough to the First Temple period. These are more from the Persian era, so it's Second Temple, but close enough to give us an idea what these things look like. So the sea itself is basically a gigantic bowl that sits on some kind of a square frame on top of 12 oxen. And there's always the question of, how is it that he's making images inside the temple? And that's always been a big question, and I don't have an answer for that one. I have to openly admit, I do not know. But it says, Vayaset hayam, verse 23, Vayaset hayam mutzak, he made the sea. So they named the sea, the big basin, the sea, because it contained a large quantity of water. Mutzak. So mutzak means to pour, which means that they actually poured this into some kind of frame. This was probably poured into a frame underground, inside the earth itself. I have friends who do metal work, and something this big, if you want to be able to pour it, you have to basically dig a gigantic structure using compacted sand and so on to actually pour this in. Eser ba'ama misfato ad sfato. It's 10 cubits from one rim to the other rim. It means you have basically a diameter of 10 cubits. Agol saviv, round all around. Ve'chamesh ba'ama komato, and 5 cubits high. And it says here, ve'kavash loshim ba'ama yisov oto saviv. And when you measure all around the circumference, it's 30 cubits. So 5 cubits high, 10 cubits from one end to the other, and then when you do a circle, when you measure the circumference, it's basically 30 cubits. And he describes some of the ornaments. Ufka'im mitachat lesfato, and there's like flowers underneath the rim. Saviv sovivimoto eser ba'ama. So there's flowers, which is a motif we see in the temple as well, and overall if you read other chapters here, all around, surrounding it, 10 cubits. Now, it means the 10 cubits is not really clear. It's not very clear exactly where these what the 10 cubits relate to, but it might be that these might be sets of 10 cubits, or every 10 cubits there's some large flower. I don't think it's very clear. But they surround Mekifim et hayam saviv. They surround it all around. Shne turim apkaim yitzukim b'yitzukato. 2 columns or 2 lines of these flowers, which were poured when it was poured, which means that it was probably when they made this is what they made it. This is a very elaborate construction, and it doesn't sound as if they had a way of welding it on, which means that they had to make the shape of the flowers when they poured the metal in. There's an interpretation that I'm reading here. It says that the flowers were 10 in each cubit, which means every cubit you can measure 10. So meaning these flowers were less than a fist size, big, which means these are really, really small ornaments. It was all around. It's like one long ring all around, but you could measure 10 flowers inside each cubit. Okay, which means there were basically something in the area of 300 flowers there. It's very, very elaborate, if this is what it means. And it says, Omed al shnei asar bakar, it stood on 12 oxen, shlosha ponim tzafona, 3 facing north, ushlosha ponim yama, 3 facing west, ushlosha ponim negba, 3 facing south, ushlosha ponim mizracha, and 3 facing east. V'hayam alehem milemala, v'chol achorem baita. And the sea was atop of them, and all their rear ends, basically their backside where the tail is, are facing inwards. That's baita, inwards. Ve'oviot tefach, it was a fist thick, which means somewhere in the area of, I would say maybe, now I'm going to start using centimeters and inches just to give this description of this. So somewhere in the area of about 3 inches-ish. It depends. Might be a little bit more than that. Somewhere in the area of between 8 and 10 centimeters, it depends who you ask. Usfato kemase sfat kos, and its rim is like the rim of a cup, which means it's probably kind of slightly folded out. You have to think as if you go up, and it kind of curves a little bit, and you got like this rim there, just a little bit. So Sfat Kos Perach Shoshan Alpayim Bat Yachil. So it's like the rim of a cup of the flower of the lily, and the lilies do curve a little bit outside. Alpayim Bat Yachil. It can contain 2,000 bat. The exact calculation of the bat is a little tricky. So I actually had to check up what Alpayim bat is, and the calculation is it's about 50 cubic meters of water. That's actually quite a bit of water. It's a lot of water. I mean, actually, I've once looked at it. My family's consumption of water throughout 2 months is a fraction of that. It's like maybe we use maybe 6 cubic meters of water, maybe 7. So this is and we're a family, showers and kids showering and using water and wasting water and everything and so on. It's a lot of water to talk about. And then we have our last verse here. It says, "Vayastam et mechonot." He made the mechonot. These are basically frames on wheels. Eser nechoshet, 10 made out of copper or bronze. Arba ba'ama orech hamechona achat, 4 cubits in length, one of the machines. V'arba ba'ama rochba, and 3 cubits wide. V'shalosh ba'ama komata, and 3 cubits high. Now, I went ahead and read this as well because this goes together with everything else. Now, I can continue reading and look at all the different things which are described here, but I brought even though I kind of moved on to one more verse, the point here is that there's a very, very important point here about all the water in the temple. Because the Temple Mount, because they need to wash the vessels and the priests have to wash themselves and so on, there's a big necessity to bring water. Aqueducts were not invented yet. The Temple Mount itself has underground water, but you have to have accessibility. We can't just have someone cranking a wheel all day pulling water out of these underground cisterns. But what's very important that comes out of this description is that there's a need to have a large sustainable quantity of water on the Temple Mount at all given moments, which means the water had to be brought out from somewhere else. And even if we talk about the underground cisterns, it still has to be transported from these cisterns all the way into the temple itself. Now, this is a very, very important thing because there's a big debate that goes on today in regards to the usage of water in the temple and where the temple got its water, bringing up theories about the temple being down in the city of David, where there is water and so on. I think this description actually indicates that water was not common inside the temple, and someone had to bring all the water in, and this is why Joshua, for example, makes the dwellers of Givon or Gibeon, he makes them into the water bearers because they needed water bearers to the temple. In any case, this was not an easy reading. There's a lot of technicalities in this reading, but there's obviously some symbology behind this. The problem is that the exact symbology is a little bit eluding, in my opinion. And there could be a lot of little details hiding between some of the words that we have here, but what we are reading is a technical piece of material. It is here to give us technicality as well, what was actually done. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that you have different types of texts. Sometimes some texts are just technical, and you have to let them be technical. But inside the technicality, for example, when it comes to temples, there is symbology. And the symbology is very, very important. I did do once a class about some of the technicalities of the temple and some of temples in overall in the ancient world, and some of the symbolism there. I might release it as a separate recording. I have to sit down and speak with someone about what exactly I did in that class, because that was quite a while back. But I've been contemplating of releasing that recording as another temple teaching that can go on the website. In any case, I hope this recording was interesting. It's a little bit of a tricky subject when it comes to technicalities, but I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to share. If anyone has insight regarding these details, be very, very interesting to hear. But I am aware of the fact that there are discrepancies in the height of the pillars, and I know all the stories around that. You don't need to send me messages and links to teachings by other people who took this whole idea about the length of the pillars, and there might have been some secret passage or some kind of lever somewhere and so on. I know about all these things. Very, very questionable stuff, in my opinion at least. But if someone has done studies on the specific, on the pillars and their construction, and on the sea, some of the details of how these things could be made, I would love to hear from you. Kol Tov.